Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dr. Ritika Subramanian, and it's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of my fellow co-conveners, Dr. Mark Tebbit and Professor Nitya Rao, to the Migration and Climate Change Seminar Series here at the School of Global Development at UEA. This seminar series forms part of the Successful Intervention Pathways for Migration as Adaptation Research Project, which is supported by the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Initiative of the IDRC and FCDO. And today we are truly honored and absolutely delighted to be joined by Professor Robert Mcleman. It's early morning in Canada, and I think on top of that, a holiday Monday. So we're especially grateful to you, Robert, for making the time to be with us today. Before I hand over the floor, I'll quickly introduce you and then it'll be over to you. So Dr. Robert Mcleman is Professor of Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada. He served as a coordinating lead author for the IPCC 2022 Working Group 2 Assessment Report and is co-author of Migration and Displacement in a Changing Climate, published by Cambridge University Press in April 2025. Over to you, Robert.
Wonderful, and thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to join you on this holiday Monday. For those of you who don't know what holiday it is in Canada, it's Queen Victoria's birthday, which we celebrate in honor of the royal family. Rather than, every time there's a new monarch choosing a new holiday date, we just go with May 24th or the weekend close enough to May 24th. So thanks for having me very much as part of your speaker series. Here's the moment of truth where I tried to share my PowerPoint with you. And so we hopefully will see my PowerPoint presentation pop up on the screen. Is it doing it for you folks there?
Yes.
Thumbs up. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So it's a fairly long title, as you can see from the title slide. Sorry, it's a little early in the morning and I haven't had my coffee yet, but I'll get rolling in just a moment. And so I'm going to just give you a quick, let's see if it's going to advance. There we go. Just let me know if it does not advance. Otherwise, I'll assume that the slide did so. So what I'm going to be doing today is giving a sort of oral history of how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, has treated the question of migration and displacement and a little bit on immobility as well since its first reports back in the early 1990s. If you want to take a deep dive into this, I wrote a study and published it on a file sharing service. It's in the chat if anybody wants to get a copy of it or follow along. And so what we did was just briefly is two colleagues and I, what we did was we went through every IPCC report published since 1990, and there are dozens of them. And we went through each document and searched for the terms migration, displacement, refugees, and Boolean variations of those terms, identified all of them, set up a series of spreadsheets, cataloged exactly what was being said about those terms in the report. We discounted any mentions of things like migrations of fish or birds or other things like that. We focused on people. And then we sort of summarized in about a 30 or 35 page report exactly what happened in those reports and sort of described some of the key themes that emerged over the course of the last 40 plus years. And so the question becomes, where we are now in terms of understanding, in terms of the IPCC, about migration, displacement, and immobility, and how we got here. And one of the reasons I wanted, well, I'll come back to that in a moment, but it's important to understand how experts in the field of climate migration, how their thinking has evolved over the decades. And then I'm going to finish this presentation with some thoughts on future research needs within the context of the IPCC process and maybe a couple other bits and pieces as well. This is the shameless self-promotion slide for this presentation. And so the third picture you see from left to right is a picture of the team that I worked with during the sixth assessment report. I was the coordinating lead author, as was said earlier, for the Working Group 2 report, and specifically the chapter on health, on health, well-being, and the changing structure of communities, with migration and displacement being a key component of the changing structure of communities. And so there's the writing team that I worked with. And the reason I did the report that I showed you on the previous screen was that when I started out doing this IPCC reporting about now 6 or 7 years ago on the reporting cycle, I wished that I had a report that described the evolution of thinking on migration and displacement. It didn't exist, and to be honest, I did not have the time back then to go through every single previous IPCC report and figure out what had been said. So one of my goals in doing this presentation today and the paper that goes with it is so that the next series of IPCC authors can have that sort of history as to what went before them, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel, so that they know what things have been said and not been said, and so that they can move forward from a knowledgeable position. Just a couple other photos on the slide. Then I've been working on this question of the links between climate change and migration for a long time. On the very left-hand side, I don't know if you can read the gold print, but that is my 1995 master's dissertation, which was on a management strategy for potential human population movements as a result of climate change when I was at the University of Hong Kong. I didn't really immediately dive into doing any further research on the topic until I started my PhD about 7 years later. I wrote a book about 10 years ago now called Climate and Human Migration for Cambridge University Press, which has been used as a textbook in a lot of courses on the subject. And on the far right, this is real shameless self-promotion. This book just came out last month, and it is co-authored with Kelsey Best of Ohio State University and Kaylee Ober of the U.S. Institute of Peace. And it's again by Cambridge University Press, and it's sort of like a 10-year update on that first book. So if you are having trouble sleeping at night, please feel free to pick up any of my publications, and I assure you they will help you out. Okay, let's dive into this. And I'm going to assume, I'm just going to keep going through just for logistics sake for another 20 to 25 minutes, and then I'll take some questions and comments after that, if that's okay. So where we are right now, so the 2022 IPCC Working Group 2 report from the 6th assessment, that is where I worked, and where I think that we did a really, really good job as IPCC authors in summarizing the current state of science as it relates to the links between climate, migration, displacement, and so on. For those of you who are not so familiar with the IPCC process, IPCC does two types of reporting. One is assessment reports, and these are the sort of bread and butter of the IPCC. And starting in 1990, these have been published every 5 to 7 years. And they typically consist of 3 working group reports. There's a working group 1, that looks at the physical science of climate change. So these are the folks who are trying to figure out, exactly what the relationships are between various greenhouse gases and the impacts that they are having on the climate itself, and some of the, the changes in statistical probability of different sorts of climate hazards and so on. Working group 2, they are the folks who say, okay, we've got these climate change impacts. What do these imply for human systems and for natural systems? So there are chapters that will look at, impacts on biodiversity and on water and so on. But there's other impacts or other chapters that look at very explicitly human impacts on urbanization, on health, and so on. And they look at the impact, our human vulnerability to them, and how we adapt to those impacts of climate change. And a term that is often used by Working Group 2, which does not actually appear in the title of their reports, is the concept of risk. So one of the things that Working Group 2 is often focused on is, okay, well, what is the risk that people are going to, for example, be displaced by hurricanes in this region of the world in this time period? And then Working Group 3 is the mitigation folks. They're the ones who say, okay, we've got this problem. What are we going to do about it? How much is it going to cost? What are some of the things we need to do to avoid the worst impacts of climate change? So those are the 3 working group reports. And then on top of that, there's a 4th report called the synthesis report, which essentially summarizes those three preceding reports. The IPCC also does special reports from time to time, depending on whether member states, which represents most UN nations, depending on the needs and interests of member states, they may commission special reports. The Working Group 2 report from the 2022 sixth assessment cycle, this is the table of contents for it. And the key messages about migration are found in Chapter 7, Health, Wellbeing, and the Changing Structure of Communities. And in particular, there's something called a cross-chapter box, which is sort of like the Rosetta Stone for this report, because this report has well over 1,000 pages, and every chapter has hundreds, if not over 1,000 references to it, all kinds of figures and statements. And virtually every chapter in this report, and there's 18 of them, virtually every chapter has mention of migration, displacement, or immobility somewhere in it, in the context of that chapter. So what we did as a team of authors from across the report, we had special meetings to make this cross-chapter box where we summarize and synthesize all of the key messages from across the report as a whole. And we have a little table telling you that if you're interested in how climate change affects small island states, you'll want to go to this section of this chapter. If you're interested in how food systems are affected by climate change and how that may affect migration, you'll want to go to that chapter and that section. So that's the key thing here. So the key messages that are in that cross-chapter box in the report are as follows. And I assume you'll read along with me, but I'll just go through them quickly. First is that migration is a strategy to improve well-being and livelihoods in response to a variety of different things. And one of them could be environmental changes, including climate change, but people also migrate in response to economic drivers, political drivers, social drivers. I think anybody who's studied migration for any length of time appreciates that. Second is that this concept of risk that the IPCC uses, risk implies something to be worried about, something to be moderated, something to be addressed specifically in a way to reduce it. Migration, from our perspective, is not a risk in IPCC parlance. Migration is something that people do. It becomes a risk only when it happens involuntarily, where people are being forced into migrating when they really would not want to. That's when migration becomes a risk. But if people are moving about because they want to move about, or for other reasons, they're getting married or things like that, that's not a risk, right? So it's a risk only when it's involuntary in nature. Or I suppose also when people are trapped in a situation they would like to move, but they're unable to move. That is a risk as well. So immobility is a risk. But again, involuntary immobility. Migration responses to climate hazards, it's often, moderated by economic, social, political, demographic, and other non-climatic processes. I mean, there's some instances where you live in a village, for example, and a hurricane blows through it and destroys all the housing in the village and all the infrastructure is gone. You have to move. Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that it's a straightforward cause and effect kind of outcome there. But a lot of migration that occurs in response to climate hazards, it sort of is moderated by or filters through these other social, economic, and political processes as well. Let's see. Oh, yes. And the direction between a climate event and migration outcomes is not unidirectional. Sometimes you have a climate event. It may cause migration to increase out of the effective area. It may actually sometimes cause migration rates to decrease out of the affected area. It may cause migration to flow in directions that it never used to. It may even lead to migration coming back into the affected area. Perhaps, for example, there's been a hurricane, it's destroyed a lot of housing, and so we have workers moving into the affected area to help rebuild the infrastructure. So there's lots of different migration outcomes that could occur in response to a given climate event. And another thing that we talked about in the report is the importance of agency. The more agency that migrants have, the greater the potential benefits for the sending areas, the receiving areas, and the migrants themselves. So we emphasize the importance of trying to give migrants more agency. And agency in this context means freedom to make decisions about when, where, and how to migrate, making sure that migrants have rights and have the opportunity to become legally documented and to participate in labor markets and so on. So in other words, making sure that migration and migrants have the opportunity to avail themselves of the rights and responsibilities that any other citizen would have. All right, let's see the next slide. Oh, I've got a couple more key messages. There's a lot of key messages in it, but it's a really thorough report. Most climate-related migration and displacement takes place within countries. There are cases where people will move across international boundaries for climate-related reasons, but the majority of cases that we could identify, people are moving within countries. Now, looking towards the future, is that it's expected that the frequency and severity of many climate extreme events, such as floods and storms and droughts, that's expected to increase. And so what that does is we do believe that that will increase the future risk of involuntary displacement in the most exposed areas. We also warn policymakers to be concerned about the future prospects of immobile populations. Policymakers tend to focus often on people on the move, but they may overlook the fact that people who are unable to move also need to be taken into consideration in terms of rights, responsibilities, and support as well. And immobility can include voluntary immobility, people who, for cultural reasons, for example, are exceedingly unwilling or unable to move from a current location, even if it's exposed to a climate hazard. Think about Indigenous people, for example, whose livelihoods and cultural well-being is tied to a specific place. We need to think about that in terms of how do we help those folks? How do we reduce their exposure to risk of having to move? And then the final one I've got on this slide is that we encourage, well, we can't encourage. We say that policy interventions that remove barriers and expand alternatives for safe, orderly, and regular migration can be part of a larger adaptation strategy to assist vulnerable people. Notice I sort of caught my own wording there. We did not actually recommend to governments that they adopt policies that can lead to safer and more orderly and regular migration, because the IPCC is not allowed to make recommendations about policy. We cannot be prescriptive to policymakers. We can only state what the facts are. Policymakers have the responsibility for making decisions based on those facts. And so in Working Group 2, Chapter 7, in the cross-chapter box, there's this nice figure that folks may have encountered where you see this sort of propeller-shaped diagram in 3 spots. And this, we call it the risk propeller in IPCC slang. And so what it suggests is that risks associated with climate change are a function of vulnerability, hazard, and exposure. So the hazard obviously being the climate hazard in question. Exposure means, you know, what people, what groups, what infrastructure are exposed to that hazard, and then the vulnerability of the folks involved. That's more the social economic dimensions of the risk. And we get this risk in the center, and then we have people responding to those risks. In the middle of the diagram, you see this sort of curtain, and it says in situ adaptation. That's because in our experience, most folks, when they're confronted with a climate hazard, the first thing that they do is not to say, oh my goodness, a climate hazard, I'm going to move. Most people will try to adapt through means that do not involve moving, which we call in situ adaptation. It's only when that in situ adaptation is insufficient that people need to move. And in some cases, the movement will actually be beneficial to the household or the community in question, in which case we get this risk propeller in the upper right corner, where the risk level goes down because it's been successful. Or alternatively, it may end up that the household, the community, the people exposed to the risk, it might actually put them in a worse situation than they were before, either through migration or through immobility, and their risk increases. So that's just a little conceptual diagram. This is an academic talk after all, so we have to have at least one conceptual diagram. Okay, so that's where we are right now in the IPCC's understanding of the key linkages between migration, and climate change. So now I want to go back to the beginning, back to the 1980s. A lot of you folks on this call will not remember the 1980s. I do. I was an undergraduate student in Canada here in the mid-1980s, mid to late 80s. So I remember all this stuff fairly well. So I'm going to go back to 1988 in particular, when the IPCC was established. If you're wondering what life was like in 1988, Michael Jordan was still the best basketball player on the planet at that time. The most popular TV show here in North America was a show called Miami Vice, with the two gentlemen you see in the center top part of your screen, dressed in very nice linen clothing. The top selling female artist in the pop charts was Whitney Houston, and George Michael over in the UK was breaking records with Having Faith and things like that. What did we know about climate change back in the 1980s? Well, it was still climate change itself, climate science itself is not a particularly new science. I mean, it goes all the way back to, the late 1700s, when Fourier was tracking or trying to figure out the heat trapping potential of different sorts of gases, going through all sorts of innovations through the 1800s and early 1900s. But it was really only in the 1970s and 80s that scientists began to really start to appreciate the scale and magnitude of the changes that human activity was having on the climate and climatic system. And so in the 1980s, scientists began to turn their attention to the idea of, okay, if we are rapidly changing the climate, what are the implications of this? How is it going to affect us? What are going to be the human impacts? And so to create a common vocabulary to talk about what those human impacts would be, the scientific community borrowed very heavily from the fields of natural hazards research and human ecology research, which use these terms like vulnerability and adaptation. And in the 1980s, governments, the public generally, started to become more and more concerned about this new, or at least new to their minds, risk of climate change. And it occurred, as you recall, during the 1980s. We had famines, we had droughts, we had a lot of extreme storms back then. And so people were trying to make sense of this. Now, remember, we were quite limited in those days to computing power. There's an Apple II computer from the early 1980s. If you have one of these in working order right now, you might actually be able to sell it for quite a lot of money. But that's the kind of computing power we were dealing with. There was a big landmark moment in 1988, and that occurred when a NASA scientist named James Hansen, who is still doing climate change research to this day, assuming that Elon Musk hasn't laid him off yet. But James Hansen was called before the US Senate to talk about this new science of climate change. And he used the term the greenhouse effect, which is just a general property of the atmosphere to trap radiation. So the 1988 was when the IPCC was formed. And so I was talking when the power went out about the fact that Dr. Hansen, maybe Elon Musk caught word of this and shut me down at my end. I don't know. So James Hansen, he was a NASA scientist. He was warning about climate change. And that day that he testified, the temperatures in Washington, D.C. were over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And that summer was one of the hottest summers experienced in the in the US on record. And so it was almost like he was a prophet talking about climate change. So politicians took it seriously. And so so in 1998, the IPCC was formed, and it was a joint initiative of the UN Meteorological Organization and the UNEP. And what they did was they were instructed by the UN General Assembly to come up with a reporting system that would allow policymakers to actually understand climate change science and its impacts and so on. And so that's why it was formed, and it issued its first assessment report in 1990. So we're going to go to the next slide, please. Now, one of the things that I sort of talked about briefly earlier was that the IPCC, what it's supposed to do and what's not supposed to do. So it writes these periodic scientific assessment reports that assess and summarize current scientific research generally about climate change. It also writes occasional special reports. The IPCC reports are supposed to lay out in detail future risks,
response options and to quantify these as precisely as possible, use standardized language, and be very objective. And so, for example, if they tend to be conservative, these reports, because if there is something that is happening with the climate, if it's still new and emerging, the authors need to wait until there's an accumulation of evidence that they can assess before they make a statement about it. So it tends to be a little bit slower than the research itself. Now, what governments do with the information in IPCC reports is up to them. The IPCC does not do original research, and the IPCC does not tell policymakers what they should or should not do with respect to that research. We can't be prescriptive. So even if it's patently obvious that the way to avoid this particular climate risk is to take this particular set of actions, the IPCC authors cannot really say that. What they can say is, when confronted with this risk, there are a variety of options, and in statistical probabilities, option X is probably cheaper than option Y or what have you, but they can't actually say, and therefore you should do it. They're not allowed to do that. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. And so this is the cover of IPCC Assessment Report 1. At the time, they didn't realize they would be doing more assessment reports, so they didn't actually call it the first assessment report. It was just the assessment report. It was organized into 4 separate volumes: the scientific assessment, the impacts assessment, response strategies, and synthesis. And we still keep that structure to this date. And a short update was published in 1992. Next slide, please. And so what happened in 1992, or sorry, this is the 1990 table of contents for the synthesis report and the headings that it used. So you look at some of these questions that are on your screen, things like, well, what is the issue? What factors determine global climate? This is kind of the stuff now that we cover in first-year environmental science, environmental studies courses today. But remember, back in the 1980s, this was all kind of new stuff. So it was a broad educational document to help educate policymakers about what was going on. Next slide, please. Who wrote the first assessment report? It was mostly volunteer scientists from wealthy countries, the United States in particular, but Australia, Canada, European countries, the UK as well, plus the Soviet Union scientific team. Those were the days of the USSR. And the report itself was edited and published by the Australian Meteorological Organization. And one of the things that was acknowledged and recognized right away was that there needed to be a better effort to include scientists and researchers from low income and less developed countries as well, because it was very heavily skewed towards higher income countries. Next slide, please. I mentioned it was updated in 1992. Why was that? 1992 was the Rio Earth Summit. So in Rio de Janeiro, folks got together, policymakers from around the world got together to start coming up with plans to deal with global environmental challenges like deforestation, desertification, biodiversity loss, and climate change. And the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was an outcome of that process. I won't talk about the UNFCCC now, but that was one of the reasons why there was an update in 1992. Next slide, please. And this is a little side sort of tangent, but it's important, is why was the Rio Earth Summit even possible, and what's significant about its timing in 1992? 1992 was a very optimistic time in history in the 20th century. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall had come down. Apartheid was being dismantled in South Africa. It was a very optimistic time. It was this moment in time where global leaders thought, okay, we've put aside a lot of hostility and confrontation and conflict. Maybe now we can turn our collective attention towards making the world a better place for all of us. Wouldn't it be nice in some ways if we could get that spirit back? Anyhow, let me get back to the next slide, please, which is the question of the evolution of migration messaging in IPCC assessment reports from 1990 until the present. So on the right-hand side of the slide, this is a timeline that I put together and that you will find in that document that's in the chat room. If you want to read through it. I'm not going to go through every single report that we analyzed I'm not going to go through them all in great detail. I think we went through 35 different reports or something like that. I just want to do sort of like a greatest hits package of what happened between 1990 and 2022. So next slide, please. My power started to come back on at my end, but I'm just going to stick with the current setup on the cell phone here, and sort of looking off at these different screens here. So in 1990, that very first assessment report, most of the migration messaging was in the Working Group 2 report. That's the impacts and adaptation. It had some strong warnings about quote unquote environmental refugees. If you know the science very well, you'll know that in the 1980s, there was quite a lot of NGO reports from the UN Development Program, UN Environment Programs, World Watch Institute, and others talking about environmental refugees. Particularly, they were talking about people being displaced by drought and famine. And so this report had some strong warnings that, climate change could create environmental refugees. If you look at the scientific evidence that these warnings were based upon, it's almost comical now when we think about it today. It would not be acceptable in a first-year undergraduate paper in a regular university course to support an argument, but there wasn't a lot of evidence back in those days. So there were strong warning, or those strong warnings were based on essentially one scholarly publication by a scientist, Jodie Jacobson, back in 1989, a lecture given at the UK Royal Society by a scholar named Tickell, and a speech given by a US military officer in Washington. That was the evidence, essentially. But the warnings were that, even a modest sea level rise could lead to tens of millions of people needing to relocate, and that climate change and migration related to climate change could lead to a loss of housing, a loss of what they called living resources, so impacts on fresh water supplies, food, energy, employment, plus a loss of social and cultural resources. Next slide, please. There were a couple really prescient observations in that first assessment report in 1990. One was in Chapter 5 that multiple risks may emerge should people need to be relocated from highly exposed areas, which might include impacts on health services, sanitation, and housing in areas to which people are relocated to. It also observed that people who are relocated involuntarily may experience psychological harm. Again, 1990, this is really seeing over the horizon quite far. And it also said that the migration of poorer people from rural to urban areas, especially in low-income countries, and from coastal areas to inland areas, especially from low-lying deltas, that seemed to be most likely the types of scenarios that would emerge. Plus, it said it could possibly also end up seeing more migration across national boundaries. So already they're sort of seeing this world where we see people moving within countries and within regions, but not necessarily huge numbers across international boundaries. So that's very interesting that they were seeing it that far in advance. Okay, next slide, please. And then we jump ahead to 5 years later, the second assessment report, again in Working Group 2. And this was where they've gone from educating policymakers to getting into the sort of, okay, here are our options for dealing with some of these challenges. And so the focus is on, okay, what are sort of the management options available to us in dealing with climate-related migration and displacement. And so some of these things we're talking about, well, how much would it cost to organize a managed retreat from the most highly exposed coastal areas, for example? There was also a discussion which we would probably not have today, which is, how can we discourage poor people from moving in the face of climate change? How can we prevent them from moving to cities? And so we probably would not frame things in those ways today, but that was a conversation back then. And there was even this idea, Well, the USSR is underpopulated, the former Soviet Union states, and there are places in Latin America with low population density. Maybe we could take climate displaced people and move them to these other locations. It's kind of an idea, again, that we would never really seriously contemplate today, but it was one of the thoughts that people were having back then. And they had this is the very first report where we actually get a conceptual diagram. I won't walk us through it, but this is how in 1995, the whole direct and indirect linkages between climate change and migration outcomes, how it was conceptualized. Now, there was an anomaly in the 1995 report, and that was in the Working Group 3 report. Recall that I told you earlier that Working Group 3 looks at mitigation, sort of, how we can reduce these risks, what policies, what they will cost, and so on. In this particular report, Chapter 6, there was a bunch of economists who were working on that chapter, and they decided to figure out how much is it going to cost if there are large numbers of climate displaced people around the world. And what they did was they did their own calculations. They did not assess peer-reviewed work by other people, and came up with this notion that, well, under 2.5 degrees Celsius warming, there could be up to 2.5 million people on the move worldwide. And how much would this cost? Well, what they decided was in the United States, it was estimated at that time the government spent around $4,000 in services on asylum claimants. So they said, well, 2.7 million times 4,000 US dollars, that's how much this is going to cost. We would never do that today in IPCC reporting. That's just a methodological practice that's not acceptable. And as one of the outcomes from that is that subsequent IPCC reports, Working Group 3 stayed away from these types of endeavors. So it's a little bit of an anomaly. Next slide, please. There was a special report in 1997, commissioned, a very important one, where the IPCC was asked to go into detail about the different regional impacts of climate change. And in this one, there was a lot of warnings about the risk of displacements due to sea level rise. The chapter about Africa and regional impacts in Africa asked openly if it would be possible to raise money to encourage people to voluntarily relocate from high-risk areas. The Latin America chapter, the authors who wrote that, again, were still focused on trying to prevent poor people from moving to cities as a result of climate change. And there was even an observation that, well, if the Arctic gets warmer, there might be more economic activity up there and therefore more labor migration to more northerly regions. So that's some of the interesting things that came out of that report. Next slide, please. Then came the 2001 report, the third assessment report. This one was our real dog's breakfast in terms of the messaging about climate change. And what this reflects is the fact that when author teams are working on these reports, especially historically, they would often be working in silos, in isolation from one another. So what the authors in one chapter were writing may not be available to the folks in the next chapter, the next chapter in the report. So we got a lot of mixed messaging. So for example, in chapter 11, the authors were saying, well, climate migration may actually provide benefits to cities because of all this additional human capital that would be coming into cities, which was a very positive way of framing the risks. A neutral one was that, well, there's a lot of different motivations for migration, and it's not always vulnerability that drives climate migration. There may be other things as well. And then there were some things that we probably would not say today. Things like, well, there will be a destabilization of international order because of environmental refugees, and these could cause conflicts, and there's multiple climate change impacts that may result, and so on. That kind of, alarmist type of approach we tend not to take anymore. And again, scarcity and conflicts and wars between countries related to climate migration. There's not a lot of scientific evidence for that, but nonetheless, it was in this report. So it's just an example of how today we are a little bit more coordinated when we're writing these reports. Next slide, please. Then came the 2007 assessment report, and here we have our very first really nice, nuanced, systematic approach towards looking at the linkages between climate and migration. And I suspect there might be one or two people at East Anglia who are actually involved in the writing of this particular report. It's a good one. It was heavily influenced by Hurricane Katrina, which happened in 2005. For those of you too young to remember Katrina in any detail, that was when the city of New Orleans was flooded for weeks on end because of the hurricane, and the human misery that occurred was very visible on our TV screens, on the BBC, on CNN, and so on for weeks. And so there was a lot of that really galvanized folks on looking at, what are the human dimensions, the human risks associated with climate-related displacement. It was the first report where scholars started to use standardized emissions scenarios to look at what would be the different, physical risks of climate change in the future. Very nuanced, avoids use of the terminology environmental refugees, explicitly discourages people from thinking about this. Climate change leads to migration, leads to conflict, leads to warring between states. They explicitly say, let's not go down that pathway. There's not a lot of evidence for it. Next slide, please. And it also talks about the future as well, and says it's really challenging to make predictions about climate and migration in the future because of, it is there are different time scales. It could be temporary migration, could be permanent migration, could be multi-directional, different locations. People have different reasons for migrating. So teasing out why they move in terms of, climate reasons versus other reasons can be quite challenging. There's a few challenges around reliable data sources. There's not many for migration, and there's very little agreement on how to define environmental migration. Many of these same challenges still exist today in different ways or shapes or forms. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to try and accelerate because I lost a few minutes because of that power outage. There was a 2012 special report on extreme climate events called the SREX report, again, looking at involuntary displacement in many chapters because of extreme weather events. And it did a nice job talking about the vulnerability of people who right now are not living in formal, well-built housing. So people who are living unhoused or who are living in informal settlements right now are extremely vulnerable and exposed to extreme weather events. And there is this concern, especially about people on small island states in this report and what will happen to them. Next slide, please. The 2014 assessment report is sort of a little bit of a back to the future in that we get some contradictions in the report between chapters and between reports themselves. The Working Group 2 report was heavily influenced by something called the 2011 UK Foresight Report, which was commissioned by the UK government to study global environmental migration. I contributed a little bit to that Foresight report. If you haven't encountered it before, you should give it a good read. It's a really deep dive into the drivers and outcomes of climate and migration. And this is the first report where we see migration and displacement talked about in almost every chapter, and typically talked about in the context of vulnerability and adaptation. Chapter 12 is the report that does the deepest dive, and there's all sorts of things discussed in that chapter that we sort of take for granted today that were not discussed previously. Things like immobility, vulnerability of indigenous groups, gender dimensions of climate-related migration, the importance of land grabs in low-income countries, the importance of remittances. There's all sorts of stuff now. It's a much more sophisticated look at the relationship. One of the weaknesses is that the Working Group 3 report, again, the one that's supposed to focus on mitigation, it actually has a lot of contradictory messages and talks again about climate, migration, conflict, linkages, and uses the term refugee to describe people displaced or on the move because of climate change. Again, stuff that the Working Group 2 explicitly has been cautioning us not to do now for about 7 years. They're back to doing it again. And the synthesis report completely ignores all of the messaging on climate migration, all the good work that was done in the Working Group 2 report. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. There was a special report in 2018 on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. There is not as much mention of climate migration and climate displacement in this report as you might think. There's a lot of attention to small island states. But the reality is that this report was trying to tease out the subtle differences between global warming of 1.5 versus 2 degrees Celsius versus more. The reality is that there's not a lot of research out there that tries to parse out how migration and displacement is going to change at these different gradations in warming. So there wasn't a lot of literature to assess in that context. I'm getting close to the finish, folks, I promise. Special Report 2019 on land and the impacts of climate change on desertification, land degradation, and so on. Another one of these reports where some of the chapters do a very good, systematic, nuanced look at the relationship to migration and displacement. So the chapters on desertification and land degradation are A1, really well done. Chapters 5 through 7, which are other aspects of climate impacts on land, contain a lot of these old, unnuanced, alarmist sorts of arguments about conflicts over food and so on, and even some basic factual errors that a close review would have shown are just erroneous. So again, there's some challenges in it, and the problem is that the summary for policymakers, which is what a lot of folks, it's the only thing they read, picks up messaging on migration from the chapters that are factually incorrect or alarmist, and ignores the migration messaging from the chapters that are actually quite nuanced and thoughtful. One of the realities of this type of work. Next slide, the SROC on oceans and cryosphere. This was a far superior treatment of the linkages between migration, displacement, and climate change impacts on oceans and frozen areas of the world. And it discusses in great detail the barriers and limits to adaptation. And as you might imagine, talks about different options for low-lying coastal areas and small island states. This is a really top-notch publication here in the context of today's lecture. Next slide, please. We're now back to where we started, the 2022 IPCC assessment report. Next slide, please. So now the next step is what to look for in future IPCC reports. Where are the weaknesses? What are the things that we have not yet come to grips with in IPCC reporting? One of the things is the reports themselves, especially the synthesis reports, which is one of those things that's supposed to be sort of a synopsis of the other three. Those synthesis reports need to have more messaging on migration and displacement in them than they have historically. Governments are going to want more information about future estimates. Whether we want to do this or not, there's a lot of challenges with making future projections of how many people are going to be on the move, how many people are going to be displaced, how many people are going to be trapped or immobile. It's really challenging work to do, but governments want that work. And we have not really had enough evidence yet built up to allow for a really thorough assessment in IPCC reporting, but maybe that'll happen in the next reporting cycle. Detection and attribution. IPCC is really focused on this. So detection means, sure, we know that climate events and conditions can cause people to move. A hurricane, causes people to be displaced from their homes and so on. But the question becomes, how much of that outcome is due to natural climate variability or things that would happen otherwise, and how much of that outcome is directly attributable to the shifting average conditions in terms of climate? In other words, the anthropogenic climate change signal within the larger causality. That's where there's a lot of demand for more research from policymakers and the IPCC itself. There's still a demand for regional and local case studies and predictions as well, not just what has happened, but what could happen in the future. More explicit linkage to the new loss and damage processes that are occurring within the UNFCCC. And links to public health as well, migrants, migration health, public health systems, and so on. Next slide, please. And the final little thing I want to do, and this is another bit of shameless self-promotion, some final thoughts on deep uncertainty. I just published a study in March where trying to come to grips, and I'll put a link to this in the chat in a couple of moments for anyone who's interested. Next slide, please. One of the realities of IPCC reporting is that it can only assess what has already been published and what we think we already know about climate change, migration, and displacement. But what if the future is not really like the present or the past? What if the physical impacts of climate change that emerge in the next few decades are unlike anything that we currently experience or what we currently expect we're going to experience in the future? What if the future political, social, and economic conditions that we all live under, what if they're radically different from what they are today? I think, that there are some folks out there like Elon Musk who would like to see them be radically different than they are today. What if future-related climate migration and displacement, what if it plays out differently in the future than it does today? We assume that what we see today is sort of what we're going to see in the future. Well, what if it isn't? And so in this article, I have some suggestions on how we deal with deep uncertainty. And I think I reflect upon things like Dungeons and Dragons and what if we had time machines and things like that. So anyhow, that's enough of me talking for today. I think we might have a couple minutes left for some conversation questions, and I will return it back to the hosts. Thank you.
That's that's super. Thanks very much, Robert. I mean, it was a brilliant canter through, like 1990 all the way through to now, looking at what the IPCC has done in relation to migration and displacement. So I for one was fascinated. So thanks very much for taking the time to chat with us. As you say, we've got a few minutes for maybe a few questions. So if anybody has a question, Ritika, perhaps if you could just monitor the chat and I'll look for the little hands that are going up. I see Neil has got a question, and I will also kind of tack one on. Well, maybe I'll go first and then hand over to you, Robert, if you could take them both together just to try and squeeze in maybe a few more. So my question related to the synthesis reporting element of the IPCC, and it'd be great just to hear from your perspective why you think it is that some things do make it into the synthesis report, maybe around the more alarmist framings of migration, and other things don't. So that's my little question. I'll hand over to you now, Neil, for yours.
Thank you, Robert. Fantastic presentation. Love this. My question is, you sort of portray the IPCC as being reflective, and those reports at the time being reflective of the science that was going on at the time. But there are other sociologists of science who look at the IPCC as an institution and say, well, actually, it's a product of the politics. The emphasis at various times being on migration because of the idea that because of the IPCC winning the Nobel Peace Prize and therefore focusing on the security and insecurity, and then downgrading it over time because of global perceptions of migration as security, these types of things. So if you could say a little bit about the IPCC as an institution, whether or not you think it simply reflects the science going on at the time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you both. And I'll take Mark's question first, because I think it's the simpler one for me to answer, which is the synthesis report. Synthesis reports are very reflective of the people who work on them, quite frankly. I know, for example, in the sixth assessment report, I personally was not involved in the writing of the synthesis. So essentially the synthesis, they take a sort of sampling of authors from across the three working groups, pull them together into a room, and they write the synthesis. And so in theory, they're supposed to check back with the folks who they worked with in their own chapters, but in reality, it sort of reflects what those folks who are in the room think should be prioritized over the thousands of issues that have been talked about in the assessment report itself. And so I think historically, just there haven't been a lot of strong advocates for the migration messaging represented at the table in the synthesis reporting. And also, you got to remember, we're focused on migration and displacement, but in the context of IPCC reporting, it's just one small topic of discussion compared to all sorts of other ones that are going on. Coming back to Neil's point, I think in reality, of course, it's reflective, and that's why I gave little sort of clues, like, for example, the one that was written in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. I mean, obviously that had a big influence on how folks sort of realized the gravity of what can happen when an extreme climate event hits a major urban center. And so I think it was maybe a little bit of an eye-opener to folks that maybe this stuff isn't just hypothetical or conceptual. Like, this is just one small example of what could happen. So I think that's a good example of how current events sort of start to influence the writings and workings of the IPCC. And Neil, you mentioned a few others, global politics over the years as well. It will be interesting to see what the next IPCC assessment report looks like in an era of, quite frankly, more right-wing governments, more interest in just burning more fossil fuels these days, in an era when governments seem to be trying very actively to restrict and prevent people from migrating, whether they're migrating for economic reasons or asylum seeking and so on. So it will be interesting to see that. And then one final thought is sometimes it just depends, I think, on the personalities that are involved in the reports in the authorship teams as well, because they are a sampling of folks from across the world. I know that, Neil, some of the chapters that I talked about in human security that you worked on in the past, they reflect the fact that you were working on the Foresight report, that you had this very deep grounding in the relationship between environment and migration. And being an IPCC author, you can bring that expertise to the table. In the working group, the authorship team that I worked with, we had a couple good migration scholars. We had some really excellent epidemiologists who got pulled away to work for their country's national health systems during the COVID pandemic, which reflected their ability to contribute to our report and so on. So these practical realities of who's involved in the writing, I think, do also influence the outcomes. Sorry, long answer, but and I could go on, but I'll try to squeeze in a couple more questions. I realize we're at the hour now. If folks, I can stay on, but if folks need to jump off, that's fine too.
Thanks, thanks, Robert. Maybe if we can just extend things by 5 or so minutes, that would be brilliant. And in that light, I think Rusty and Sarah, I'll ask you just to come in and ask your questions. If you could keep your questions brief, that would be appreciated. And then similarly, Robert, if you could keep your answers also brief as well, that would be great. So Rusty first, over to you.
What do you think, Mark? Do you want to just give me a question from the chat?
Hang on, Sarah, are you good to go? Oh no, maybe not. Okay. Well, in that case, there is. Oh look, there we go. Right. So Sarah's question is: when people move from rural to urban areas in response to climate events, how can cities get prepared for that in order to create benefits for all? And how, as researchers, can we support this process? And then there are another couple of questions in the chat. Shall I fire them all off to you, Robert?
Sure, why don't you? And I'll choose the ones that seem easiest for me to answer.
Okay, and then we've got, I'd love to hear more about whether alarmist views have really been dispelled within countries. These are prevalent in many places, which of course is what work at UEA now addresses. So kind of something on alarmist views, how prevalent they are or are not. And then one from Case, focusing on the synthesis report. He would be interested to know how you, I assume that's you, Robert, evaluate the messaging on migration and displacement in the summary for policymakers, which needs to be approved by governments.
Yes, okay, thanks. And we actually had another power surge here in Flickr, so I caught most of that. So apologies if there's a lag at my end. So the first thing is the question about how do we make cities better prepared for rural to urban migration. There's a great chapter in the most recent Working Group 2 report specifically on challenges for cities. And that is, there are some of those questions are answered within it. And it is a pressing one for cities all across the world, high-income countries, low-income countries, all folks. And then the second one, the summary for policymakers, that is a challenging one because it is negotiated by the countries themselves and not by the authors of the report. And so that has been a case where some of the migration messaging has been diluted, where quite a few other messages get diluted as well, because for those who are not familiar with the process, the countries negotiate what the words will be line by line, dot by dot, sentence by sentence, and so on. And so just in my experience, for example, we had a message that we put into our chapter where we said, I won't name the country, but we said in this country, poor people, when they're displaced by droughts or water shortages, are treated very poorly, essentially, by their government officials. And that was based on scientific evidence. And we didn't make that up ourselves. We just reported on what was said by scientists in that country about their own policymakers. And those policymakers from that country wanted that stripped from our report. They were quite incensed about that. But as authors, we kept it in. But it certainly did not make its way to the summary for policymakers. So it's a good example of how, yeah, it's going to be watered down. And as researchers, you really need to dive deeply into the report itself and not just stick to the summary for policymakers, because there's lots of good material underlying that stuff. Mark, I'll give it back to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Robert. And I think we've now probably slightly overstayed our allotted time, so I'm going to bring things to a close. So just a couple of things from me. The first is to thank you once again, Robert, for making the time to take us through migration within the IPCC on a national holiday very early in the morning and with a power cut to boot. So thank you for kind of persevering in that regard. Much appreciated. Thanks to Ritika, who's kind of put everything together in the background, as well as Connor, who works in our dev office. And then lastly, just to highlight that our next and final seminar of the series will be on June the 2nd with Dr. Jelle Wouters, looking at multi-species migration in the Himalayas. So quite a step change from Robert's presentation, but should be very interesting nevertheless. So thank you all very much.